Welcome to the 63rd episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit show. I am your host, Mark Hasara, and for over 60 years, my passion has been aviation. I love everything about airplanes. For 24 and a half years, I flew KC-135s all over the world, passing gas into numerous airplanes, and absolutely love that job. Love being in the Air Force. On the Lessons from the Cockpit show, we hear from some of the most intriguing and fascinating pilots, maintainers, aircrew members, and aviation enthusiasts from all over the world. On our show, we hear their incredible stories, but more importantly, what did they learn from these extreme and extraordinary military, commercial, and even general aviation experiences? Our purpose is to learn how does the aviation world work, but more importantly, critical thinking skills both in the air and on the ground. Many of the stories that you hear on the Lessons from the Cockpit show are being told for the very first time. Financial support to continue the Lessons from the Cockpit show come from two sources. The first is the book Tanker Pilot, Lessons from the Cockpit, found in Amazon in all four formats: hardback, softback, Audible, and Kindle. Softback version has all the pictures in black and white. The other 32 color pictures of the actual events that are talked about in the book. Second source, Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. These are 4, 6, and 8 foot profiles of aircraft printed on vinyl that you can peel off and stick to the walls of your home, office, or hangar. These profile prints are so detailed you can even read the stenciling on the bombs and the missiles. We do a lot of research when we draw these aircraft. A lot of them are aircraft that our guests have flown in combat. On today's show, I'm going to talk to you about one of my assignments that I'll tell you, initially I didn't want it. And it was a place that we all made fun of at Kadena, but it ended up being one of the most rewarding and one of the most educational experiences of not only my Air Force career, but of my life. So, grab an adult beverage of your choice, sit down, strap in, and let's begin a discussion about how I became an expert at air mobility operations around the world from this one assignment near St. Louis, Missouri. In April of 1995, I'd been on the island of Kadena, flying with the 909th Air Refueling Squadron for 5 years. 5 wonderful years. But it was time for me to find a new assignment. Where do you go after you've had what will probably end up being the greatest flying assignment of your Air Force career, even though you're only a captain and you've got a lot of years ahead of you? I did not want to leave, but it was time for me to go. I was on the major's promotion list. And normally when you become a major, you go to a headquarters tour. Now, I have an interesting story about that Mary, the OG exec, told me. All of the 06s on base get together and they say, okay, here's all the people that I have that are up for major, and they all sit with the wing commander. Wing commander chairs this particular board. And General Cliver walks in, Jeff Cliver, biggest F-15 pilot I've ever seen. He's like 6'6", a massive guy, but a great, great commander. We all loved working for Jeffrey George Cliver. He comes in and he says, okay, these are my 3 protected people. Cruiser Wilsbach from the 44th, Weeby Young from the 67th, and Sluggo Hasara from the 909. Now let's talk about everybody else. So on my PRF, or my promotion recommendation file, I had a definitely promote. I was going to get promoted to major, and I knew it. And when they handed me my PRF, it says right there, definitely promote, with a lot of great flowing words about who I am and what I've done, and signed by General Cliver. So I know at this time period that I'm going to be a major. I've got to go to a headquarters. We had a fairly new ops group commander there, deputy ops group commander. His name was Colonel Jim Pugh. We called him Pepe Le Pew. He left Kadena with 106 hours of F-15 time, because he said, I have got to learn how everybody does their business in this wing. And the best way to do that is to go fly with the squadron. So he'd fly with the AWACS, fly with the helicopters. But he told me when I saw him much later that he ended up having, I think, over 90 rides in the F-15 and 106 hours of Eagle time, which is pretty cool. Well, I come to the squadron one day and I've got another sticky note on my desk that says, Sluggo, come see me. Pepe. And I know he's going to counsel me on where I should go next. And he's just taking care of his people. He's being a mentor, and he was a great mentor. But he had come from a place to Kadena, I'll be honest with you, we made fun of, because this agency had no control over the 909th Air Refueling Squadron, even though we were a KC-135 squadron. We belonged to Pacific Air Forces, we were directed by Pacific Air Forces, and every once in a while we would do missions for this agency, but it was kind of a laughing joke, ongoing joke with us all. Well, they don't control us and never will. I get over to his office, he said, okay, Sluggo, mentoring time. I'm going to give you some counseling and some advice. I go, let me have it, sir. He says, you're on the majors list. Congratulations. And he tells me the same story about Cliver saying, these are my 3 protected people. He says, you need a career broadening headquarters assignment if you're going to continue in the Air Force and get promoted. So I knew where he was going with this, okay? He was recruiting for where he just came from. And he told me, for you to be an air mobility expert, there's only one place on the planet that you can go and literally become an expert at all aspects of air mobility. And I said, okay, sir, where's that? Knowing all full well what it was. And he said, this place. And I said, okay, sir, well, let me think about it. He goes, you need to more than think about this, okay? You will be a better asset to the Air Force and to the air mobility community if you take an assignment to this place. I said, well, sir, are you like a recruiter for him? He goes, I have been asked to be a recruiter by the Brigadier General who's in charge of this place. And Sluggo, you're one of the people I would love to send there. You know everything there is to know about air refueling, but you don't know everything about air mobility. And this is the place to learn that. And I said, okay, sir, well, let me talk to my wife about it, think it over, and then I'll get back to you. And he goes, okay, great. Well, I went home and talked it over with Val. I had 3 young kids at the time. As a matter of fact, I think the youngest was Jeffrey. He's only a year old. And we thought, you know what? This would be a good place to go. And family will be close to us. A little bit of a drive to get to Val's family. But yeah, this would actually be a great location for us. So, in fact, I came back to Colonel Pugh and I said, all right, let's do it. And I look back at my time period here at this agency with great fondness, particularly because of the things that I got to do. When 2 colonels put their collective heads together and say, I want this person here, that's where you're going to end up. So there was a by name request done by Pepe and a by name request done by a Colonel Edwards at the TACC. And of course, that assignment sailed right through. Not a lot of people wanted to go to the TACC. And here we got a guy that says, I want to come to the TACC. So this was pretty much a done deal. And we got our orders to come to Scott Air Force Base to work in the TACC. Now, there's a very interesting thing that happened before we left that I want to share with you. My wife's maternal grandfather was killed on the island of Okinawa during Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa. 1995 was the 50th anniversary of that battle. And what they were going to do is the Japanese and the Americans were going to get together, have this big celebration for this event. And for some reason, we could not get orders. And Valerie was ready to leave. Rachel, Ryan, Jeff, our 3 kids, they wanted to go. It was like, how come we can't get orders? How come we can't get orders? I want to go, I want to go, I want to go. Well, we found out that this special celebration, that they were going to unveil these marble walls that had everybody's names on them who died, Americans that died during Operation Iceberg, and her grandfather, Roy Smith, would be on those. So we ended up staying for that. And I almost caused an international incident, okay? I didn't see the memo, didn't hear about the memo that said, you American military guys do not wear your uniform to the ceremony. Guess who went in his blues? Short sleeve shirt. Sluggo. Well, there was all of these World War II vets and 4-star admirals and generals, Marine Corps, everybody there. And I show up in my blues, and of course this one 4-star general from the Marine Corps says, Captain, did you not get the memo that you weren't supposed to be here in uniform? And I said, sir, obviously not. But they unveiled these things after a ceremony, and we went and found Grandpa Roy's name. Valerie brought some tracing paper and a pencil, and she did a pencil etching of Roy W. Smith, Private United States Army, and his name on the marble plaques. One for her mother, one for her Aunt Carolyn, whose father was Private Roy W. Smith. And it was really a moving thing to see this and to be a part of this celebration of this invasion and have our family literally connected to it. And of course, Val was on TV. The local Japanese TV asked her, why are you here? What are you doing here? And she gave the story about her Grandpa Roy dying in the Battle of Shuri Castle, buried on the island at first, but now buried in Hawaii in the Punch Bowl with all of the other service members that died there. A couple days after this celebration, orders show up in the mail. I have the orders, which means that we can start to move. And she says, I'm out of here. And she goes home with the kids, and I end up packing up the house and moving. Now, I meet up with the family, Valerie and the 3 kids, in Salt Lake City. That's where she's from, Sandy, Utah specifically. And then we fly to St. Louis to our new assignment. This kind of showed me how long we had been gone out of the United States. We're driving in a rental car around St. Louis on the east side, getting ready to go across the bridge to the Illinois side. And of course, there's the big arch right there. And Rachel, who is a kindergartner, maybe first grade now, looks out the window, looks up at it and goes, wow, Dad, Mom, this is really a cool place. What language do they speak here? We have to tell her we're back in the United States. They speak English here. It was just a funny moment for being back in the States after being gone for so long. We find a house in Troy, Illinois, which was really a nice place. We loved that place. Big basement. I used to chase the kids and play with the kids down the basement. It had a pool table in it, but the previous owners, people that owned it, I said, no, I don't want the pool table. And so we had this big open area where I could play with the kids. It was just a fun place to live. But my son, Ryan, who I think is about 3 years old at this time, he's having none of it. And all of you that are in the military know that when you have children and you move like this, particularly Ryan, because he was born in Okinawa, he's kind of having a hard time adjusting to being in a very new place with no friends at the ripe age of, I think, 4 or 5. Well, he blurts out one day, I don't like it here, I hate it here, I'm going to go back to Okinawa and live with my friend Brian J. His dad was a Marine Corps lawyer back in Okinawa. And Ryan announces, I'm going back to Okinawa. Well, one day I wake up to everybody screaming in the house, Mark, come downstairs. And I come downstairs out of my groggy sleep, and there's about a 1.5 foot long garter snake that had come in the downstairs door and was laying in front of our entertainment center, our Oak Entertainment Center from Okinawa. And, I pick him up by the tail and escort him out. And then Ryan finally says, okay, I can live here now. There's animals here. And there was a creek in our backyard, a small creek in our backyard. And I took him back there one day and I said, look, Ryan, there's always going to be snakes. Be careful of the snakes. Don't play with the snakes. But look, here's frogs and here's all these different animals that are running around back here. And finally says, okay, I can stay here now. Who would think that for a 5-year-old, having frogs and snakes in the backyard would be the thing that would put you over the edge for staying in a new assignment? All of you that have been in the military and have come home from long overseas assignments know that it is really an adjustment for your kids particularly, because now, particularly young kids, they have to make all new friends. And fortunately, there was a lot of kids in our neighborhood. Ryan, Rachel, even Jeffrey, as little as he was, had plenty of friends in our house. We were kind of in a really rural area, kind of out by ourselves. There wasn't a lot of homes in our area. It took me about 20 minutes to drive to work every day, coming from the north to the south to the Air Mobility Command headquarters. It was just a really nice place for us to live after coming over from Okinawa. Accomplishing all of the in-processing chores, finding a house, finding a vehicle, getting the kids all settled in school, I began my controller's certification process. We are actually, as a West Cell duty officer, my job is to run airlift, air refueling, aeromedical evacuation, all the different missions that go along in Air Mobility Command's world. And I have to learn about all of these. I know a lot about air refueling, but very few of the missions that I dealt with were tankers. Not to say that tankers weren't part of what I was doing, because the KC-10, as you know, carries a lot of cargo, but I did very little air refueling missions and controlling those. It was predominantly airlift missions, which I knew nothing about. I came from the air refueling world, and now I'm learning a whole new world of mobility, and that is moving cargo, passengers, patients by air. Oh, let me quickly explain West Cell, East Cell. The Tanker Airlift Control Center at that time period was divided in half at the Mississippi River. From the Mississippi River west to Mumbai, India was considered the West Cell. So you had the United States, all of the Pacific, Alaska, South America was partially in our group too, but predominantly we looked at the Pacific. Now, I had just come from the Pacific and I was an expert in operations throughout the Pacific because as a tanker guy, I knew all the rules, all the restrictions. No matter where a mission was going throughout the Pacific, you had diplomatic rules that you had to follow. You had cargo rules you had to follow, all these different things that you had to do. And I was, of course, very, very familiar with those. So I was in an AOR that I understood. I didn't understand how to do cargo missions, though. I'll be honest with you. When I first showed up there and I'm learning all this, my head is just swimming because I'm having to learn how long they can be on the ground, an augmented crew is, how many pallets each airplane can carry, all of these different restrictions, which are found in one book that we had that we referred to obviously all the time. And it was a command and control of air mobility operations book. But I had to learn all of this and then become certified on this because we're treated as if we're like air traffic controllers. We are under the same FAA rules as like dispatchers and air traffic controllers. So we would work like a mid, swing, graveyard shift, maybe 2 graveyard shifts. So you work for 6 days, but then you got 4 days off that you would just be at home recovering from your stressful job of being this controller at the Tanker Airlift Control Center, which was really a sweet deal for the family because I had been gone so much at the 909. And now I'm at home and I've got like 4 days where I'm off and we can go out and visit all these different places in the St. Louis area, drive over to Tennessee, get some good barbecue in Memphis, all these different things. And the great thing was my mom and dad lived in Dayton, Ohio, which was only about a 5-hour drive. So we got to spend some time with them and they got to play with their grandkids, which was really a big bonus for being. That's how we divvied up the earth. West Cell, East Cell having everything from the Mississippi River to Mumbai, meaning Europe and Africa. And they were always, always busy because at this time, stuff's going on in Bosnia that just boggles your mind, okay? And we're doing African humanitarian missions. And this is during the Clinton administration. While I'm there, he wins the second election, is going to be the president again for another 4 years. And I'll get into that in just a second. So that's kind of the time frame and how the earth was split up between the two cells and how we were treated as air traffic control / dispatchers for like an airline. It was really tough at first for me to learn all of this because about 85% of our missions were all airlift or aeromedical evacuation, which I had no experience with whatsoever. So I felt pretty inadequate at first. And of course, you're assigned somebody to watch over you. You know, you're the new guy and somebody's watching over your shoulder and how you're doing things. And everything runs off this form called a 57 in the computer and all the notes are there and what the mission's going to do, what kind of cargo they're carrying, what day and time they're going to be at a certain place is all carried on this form 57 that's in this computer. So I had to learn all of this and I was feeling behind big time. And that's an uncomfortable place for me. As I did more missions and I got more familiar with the procedures, I fell right in line with everybody else. And as tanker folks, we are really, really good at putting together like white sheet missions. White sheet I define as here is a desperate situation and now you have to solve the problem. jigsaw puzzle that you've never seen before for the first time, and now all of a sudden you got to put it together. That became one of the things that I most enjoyed about being at the Tanker Airlift Control Center. Every day was something different. Every day there was some crisis that we had to handle. Now, the E-Cell had a lot of crises that they had to handle simply because there was stuff going on in Africa. There was stuff going on in Europe with Bosnia. And, of course, we would later go to war in Kosovo. But the West Cell, I got to be honest with you, man, there were days where it was just a yawner. Oh, my gosh, I'm finding things to do to just keep myself busy. I'm not going to read a book or anything. I'm doing some studying, but I'm studying processes and procedures out of our C2 book. That's kind of what we did during the day. But in the West Cell, we really didn't have the intensity that we did in the East Cell. There were days where it was extremely intense, where billions of dollars worth of equipment was involved, cargo was involved, humanitarian missions down to the South Pole in one instance, or bringing a baby from Kadena back to Travis Air Force Base. And I'll talk about that mission here in a moment, because that became a very fascinating mission that actually involved somebody I know. Now, for all of this to function, we obviously had different groups or agencies inside the Tanker Airlift Control Center that managed certain aspects of the things that we did. We had flight planning folks that all they did was do flight plans for airplanes. We had diplomatic clearance folks. All they did was diplomatic clearances for airplanes going into South America, Africa, Europe. And every country has different diplomatic clearance requirements that you had to be up on. Of course, we had books, our U.S. flip books. There's a diplomatic clearance guide that tells you, there's quiet hours at this base. You can only take off and land between these time periods. You can't take off or land after this time. You have to get what's called a PPR number, prior permission required number, in order to fly into this location. They can only take certain amount of airplanes at this location, certain types of airplanes at this location. And you had to know all of these things in order for you to run missions. And of course, this command and control publication that we operated from had all of that in it. But again, I'm brand new and I'm really struggling to do some of these missions. But we tanker guys are really, really good about throwing things to last minute, because that's our life. We're constantly getting tasked to go do something else. And now I'm doing missions where literally a phone call or something that appears on CNN gets us energized. Other agencies we had inside the TACC, we had what was called the barrel. There was a tanker barrel, there's a 141 barrel. This is the group that says, okay, this base has these many airplanes available. Travis has this many KC-10s, this many C-141s available, C-5s available. McGuire has this many C-141s, KC-10s available. Dover, and that was all controlled by these barrels. So when we had a mission where we had to put something on real fast, sometimes we had to go back and find out, hey, does this base even have an airplane available? And if they didn't, then we had to find an airplane that was already out, what we called in the system, in order to fly the mission. And that happened all the time. Each one of the Air Mobility Command airplanes had a planning staff upstairs, watched over the fleet. There was a C5 group, KC-10 group, 141 group, KC-135 group, C-130 group. It was always funny to go by the C5. The C5 is notorious for breaking. When Bill Clinton won the second election, his administration, before they moved in, they went all over the Pacific with C5s and were kind of thanking everybody, I guess, for getting them in office. I don't know. You can only carry the limousine on a C5 because it's so dang heavy. And we had 24 C5s that were spread throughout the Pacific. And I think out of the 24, I think 7 of them broke all at one time. We had one in Australia, one in Hawaii, one in Guam, one in Japan, one in Okinawa, all busted. Some of them hard broke that were going to be there for a couple days before we finally got them all back from the presidential support missions. Those were called Phoenix Banner missions. Those were untouchable, as you can imagine. There's a big entourage that goes with the president anytime he goes overseas. Those Phoenix Banner missions were of the highest priority, obviously. Carrying the Beast was a big deal. All the other vehicles that had to go along with the Secret Service. And in some cases, refueling the 747 Air Force One was also a priority. And the National Airborne Command Post, the E-4 Doomsday plane, was always following him around too, wherever the president went throughout the Pacific. So those missions got really high visibility, high priority, and you wanted to make sure you did not mess those up. Like I said, fortunately, I had been to every base, every location throughout the Pacific. I understood all the rules and restrictions. So when President Clinton was traveling through the Far East, I was managing the majority of his missions. Now, we did something really cool. My daughter, when she was in the second grade, I found out that another TACC controller had done this. And we put a stuffed animal, it was a dinosaur we called Dino, and we put it in a container, some kind of box. We actually would fly it on airplanes and see if we couldn't get it to circumnavigate the globe. You kind of put a little tag on Dino in his box, and believe it or not, Dino, this stuffed animal dinosaur from Rachel's class, actually made it on Air Force One. And First Lady Hillary Clinton put 2 bags of peanut M&Ms in his little container that he was traveling in with a little note to the class. It was kind of cool. You know, I mean, it's not every day a class gets a note from the First Lady of the United States with peanut M&Ms. And of course, there was a lot of other things in there that the crews would put in. There was an Australian flag, all these kinds of things. It took about, I think, 27 days for Dino to leave Scott Air Force Base, make it to Travis, and then literally circumnavigate the globe, almost hit every continent, and make it back to me with all of this cool stuff that was in its box. A number of the TACC controllers did this. It was really interesting to go back to Rachel's class and present Dino, the dinosaur, to the class and read the logbook from the crews that had flown Dino. Because each of the crews would say, hey, this is crew Umpty Ump. We're flying on a C-5 today out of Singapore. We're going to Australia. We gave Dino dinner, and we put a little Instamatic camera in the box with it. And some of the pictures on that box were fabulous. One crew ended up in Sydney, Australia, went down to the bay where they have that opera house, and they were across the bay from it, and the crew took a picture of themselves holding Dino with the opera house behind it. How cool is that? The following year, I did it again too, but this time it kind of got lost in the system, but eventually did make it back to me. We lost track of him for about 5 days. I can't remember what stuffed animal it was. I think it was a panda bear. It was just fun for the class to read this logbook and find out all the different crews that flew the thing and what they were doing. And in the logbook, First Lady Hillary Clinton put a note to the second grade class and 2 bags of peanut M&Ms off of Air Force One inside the box. All of these agencies work together to move passengers, patients, cargo, fighters that are deploying over to the Middle East or to Europe. Exercises, there was a whole exercise shop that handled all of the exercise movements. There was even a special operations shop whenever they needed help to move whatever equipment they needed to move somewhere. That group managed all those missions, planned them all, cut them all into the computer on a Form 57. So all of these agencies would come together. Oh, and there was a weather agency too. A bunch of weathermen, experts. All they did is watch the weather worldwide. And of course, in the Pacific, the one thing that we had trouble with is we always had typhoon season. Having experienced that being at Kadena, I knew what it was. A lot of people that I worked with had no idea that, hey, there's like 180 mile an hour winds in some of these things. But there was even a weather shop. And that was a shop that we had to go to a lot to say, hey, what's it going to be like on this day during this time period at this location? We've got this mission that we got to put in there. All of a sudden, because of the humanitarian issue, the weather guys, the dip clearance guys, and the tanker and airlift barrel guys and gals, I was constantly standing in front of them trying to put these missions together. All of this was run by a fairly senior colonel or 06 from a desk in the middle of the floor. And he was called the senior. He was the one who really had the thumbs up, thumbs down decision on missions that were going wherever they might be going or whatever plan you were putting together. These senior controllers were very experienced air mobility command experts. Most of them in the airlift community because that was the majority of the missions, but we had some that had air refueling background also. That senior controller was the belly button that we would go to on a pretty regular basis when something would pop up and we had to come up with a plan. The TACC was actually commanded by a brigadier general. I can't remember the name of the brigadier general when I first got there, but he was only there like a couple weeks when Brigadier General Bill Welser came in to be the TACC commander. And I ended up working for him twice at the TACC, and then again when he became the commander of the Air Mobility Warfare Center when we were standing up the KC-135 weapons school. He was the commander and had overall control of all of the different agencies in the TACC. But on a daily basis, I was always interacting with that 06 that was sitting at a desk. And what's interesting, around his desk, he had 3 flat screen TVs. One on CNN, one on MSNBC, and one on Fox News. Because literally, we would begin planning for a mission if we saw a CNN, Fox News, or MSNBC alert. I can't even count how many times we began planning a mission based on a newscast. And if you go read my book, Tanker Pilot, there's one chapter where I talk about Korean Air Flight 801 and what we had to do to move some critically burned patients when a Korean airline 747 landed in the hills short of the runway in Guam. And one of the only survivors, American survivors, was a 9-year-old daughter of a Korean national named Gracie Chung. I'm not going to talk about that one here because you can go and read it in the book, but it was a terrible tragedy. We were able to get some people back here to a burn center. Unfortunately, Gracie did not make it through her 3rd surgery down at Brooks in San Antonio. Oh, it's heartbreaking when we heard the news. One of the nurses came over and told us, and she was just bawling. All of us were bawling. And see, it still makes me emotional. And she came over and told us, hey, we just wanted to tell you, Gracie Chung died about 30 minutes ago on the operating table while they were working on her. But again, that senior controller, very experienced 06 in AMC, senior 06, had probably most of them, if not all of them, had been wing commanders already and were now doing like a headquarters tour, getting ready to either get promoted to brigadier general, move on, or retire. Whenever there was big decisions to be made or political leaders called the TACC, they always called the senior's desk. He was always getting phone calls. She was always getting phone calls. That senior 06 at that desk. That's the other thing I want to mention just real quick. We had either 3 8-hour shifts or 2 12-hour shifts. When we were manned the way we're supposed to be, in other words, we had all the people we needed, we were at 8-hour shifts. There were times when critical events were happening around the world where we would go to 12-hour shifts. That's a long time to be at work. But during that time period you're at work, you're staying pretty busy most of the time. But like I said, the West Cell, there were days where I was fighting to stay awake, just simply because we didn't have all of these intense operations like Africa and Europe were having, and the East Cell folks were just constantly busy. And that basically was the makeup of the TACC in the 1995 to 1997 timeframe when I was there. Under the 618th AOC, it is completely different. It is an air operations center, strategy cell, ops cell, planning cell, all of these different agencies like in a normal air operations center, and they run it like a normal air operations center. There's no East or West cell anymore, what I'm told. Pretty much operates like we were at the Prince Sultan Chaos. That's how the TACC was split up. That's how we split up the Earth, and those are the agencies that all work together to make the mission. So let me give you some statistics just real quick. If I remember right, during a 24-hour period, it was not uncommon for the West Cell to plan and execute anywhere between 300 and 400 airlift tanker missions a day during a 24-hour period. And that makes up for a lot of missions, a lot of cargo moving, a lot of gas moving, a lot of fighters that are deploying to different places, a lot of exercises that are going on. You had to keep an eye on all of these things happening. Now, in the West Cell, we had duty officers like me But we also had a lieutenant colonel that was like the chief of the cell. Colonel Kolodka was one that I worked with a lot. When we had to come up with plans, it was usually run through this lieutenant colonel cell chief, then to the senior for his final blessing. And that's when we would cut it into the computer on a Form 57 and off the thing would go. There were duty officers, captains, majors like myself. We had a lot of reservists that worked in the different cells. All of them had been flyers at some point in their careers, but now we're like flying for the airlines, but we're still guardsmen or reservists that would come in and work too. It was always great when you had one of these guard or reserve guys come in, because that meant one of us active duty West Cell controllers got to go home. They would say, hey, I got to work some hours, go home. Sometimes it would be one, sometimes two of these reservists would show up. And the active duty guys would say, okay, we'd have a changeover brief. I'd say, okay, here's what's going on with these missions. You got to watch these here. And you'd go home. It was great having this active duty and reserve group of folks working together. So I saw no problem when the reserves, the guard, and the active duty units do the Vulcan mind meld and kind of come together as one unit. I'd been in the TCC, saw it work, and it worked great. Now, we also had non-commissioned officers, sergeants, senior master sergeants, so forth, that were also working with us to move the missions. Their job was also to help plan the missions. Their job was also to get the missions in the computer in the Form 57. So when we came on shift, there'd be about 8 to 9 of us, plus the cell chief, the lieutenant colonel cell chief. Oh, and most of the cell chiefs had been squadron commanders in some air mobility airplane too. So they understood the air mobility piece real well too. You'd have anywhere between 3 and 4 officers, 5 or 6 NCOs, and a lieutenant colonel chief that would be working a shift, whether it be 8 hours or 12 hours in each cell. When a new group would come on, we'd have a changeover brief. As I mentioned, here's the missions to watch. Here's the ones that are being watched. Here's the ones that are coming down the pike that are going to be complex. And this changeover brief usually took, 10 to 15 minutes. And you'd go over the Form 57 on a computer screen and put notes in the computer for all the things that were happening. As the mission would move along, we would constantly put in notes that had a date time stamp to them, whether maintenance problem at Guam, a C5 breaks down there, what parts does it need, where do they need to come from, probably from Travis, which means you had to put on an airplane, get it over. Those would be the kinds of things we'd put in the notes. Higher priority cargo at this base, bump this cargo off. I'm sorry, Marine Corps. It always seemed to be the Marine cargo that got kicked off, and I always tried my best to keep the Marine cargo moving. We also had priorities for missions depending on the cargo, the passengers, or the patients that they were carrying. Priority 1A was the president. 2B was still a high priority, but that meant it was really high priority cargo or really critically ill patients that were being aeromedical evacuated out of a particular area. We'd see those all the time too. And then, of course, we had to work around all the typhoons. We spent a lot of time in the summertime through the late fall in the weather shop trying to figure out where the typhoons are going, because Guam would close when a typhoon would go over across it. The Philippines seemed to be the one place that every typhoon went over the top of. We kind of nicknamed it the mobile home park of the Pacific because it seemed like every major typhoon went through the Philippines. But then again, it went through Korea, went through Okinawa a lot too. So we kind of had to keep in touch with the weather and keep track of the weather during these time periods. And the NCOs were really good at putting all those pieces of the puzzle together, putting them in the computer, making sure that the missions kept running. Frustrated cargo was always a constant pain. Frustrated cargo meaning cargo that got bumped for a higher priority cargo. And again, the Marine Corps was always after us because they never seemed to be able to get the higher priority to move their cargo, and it would show up like a week or 2 weeks late. They'd be at an exercise for like a week and wouldn't have all their stuff. And we tried to tell them, you need to put this at a higher priority and you need to put this like at the exercise priority and everything, but a lot of times it was just because higher priority cargo made it in front of them. Their pallets would be like in a warehouse in Guam or something like that. We had different kinds of missions, and I want to talk about those just for a second. We had what was called SAMs, and usually when you're dealing with the president, it had a SAM call sign. And these were high priority passenger missions that were moving the president or dignitaries throughout the Pacific. We had what was called channel missions, and these were missions that moved cargo to different locations. And a lot of times these locations were fairly predominant. The KC-10s and C-141s flew what was called a SID. And SID stands for, I think, Series Interoperable Deployment, where they would go to Yokota and they would be deployed for, I think, 30 days. And all you would do is move cargo. And it was always to the same places. The SID missions would fly from Yokota to Singapore, Singapore to Diego Garcia, and then I think from Diego Garcia to Masira. They'd be on the ground for 24 hours, and then they would turn around and come back home. Now, if you're doing a 141 on a SID mission, the trip from Singapore to Diego was a stretch, and it's a long mission. And the 141 could do it. They could do it a lot better if they got air refueled, but they didn't have air refueling tied to these. The KC-10s from Travis and McGuire also went into the SID at Yokota. And again, these missions are carrying high priority cargo to these different locations. Sometimes it was packs too. They would carry passengers also. These SID missions we followed pretty closely because most of the time this was really high priority cargo. Why Singapore? A lot of people ask me that. What they would do is put certain types of cargo on the KC-10, fly it into Singapore, and then it would be offloaded there, and usually it ended up on Navy ships. They would resupply the Navy ships with a lot of the stuff that we brought down on the SIDS. A lot of it was bought locally, lettuce, hot dogs, hamburgers, fuel, jet fuel, all those kinds of things would be handled sometimes locally, but these SIDS would also bring this high priority cargo that the Navy and the Navy bases that were at these different locations required. Then there was requirements channels, and these were just the normal everyday requirements. We need milk, butter, different kinds of food, water, parts for airplanes or ships or stuff. Those were considered requirements channel. Requirements missions, not requirements channels. So you had requirements missions, and then you had channel missions. And that pretty much covered all of the cargo missions. We had aeromedical evacuation missions, and these were obviously very close watched. There was a C-9 Nightingale Squadron at Yokota. There was one at Scott, and then I think there was another one in Europe, but I can't remember where. I think it was in Germany somewhere at Rhein-Main, I think is where it flew out of. So there's these 3 C-9 squadrons, and all they did was fly patients that some cases were critical to the different hospitals, or would go downrange to get patients to bring back to Landstuhl, Germany, which was right next to the air base at Ramstein. That's where it was, Ramstein. They were based out of Ramstein because it was close to the Landstuhl Hospital. Aeromedical evacuation were planned and run by the nurses that were not too far from where we were sitting in our West Cell. And those missions had a pretty high priority because usually those people on board were pretty sick or had been involved in an accident. We had to move a guy from McMurdo Station in the South Pole to New Zealand, where he got picked up by a KC-10 and was brought to Yokota because he'd had some serious heart problems and had developed those while he was down on the ice. Those aeromedical evacuation or AE missions could be pretty heart-wrenching at times, but man, when you saved some people's lives, there was elation, as you can imagine. Let me talk about one of these AE missions that I was involved with. And as I mentioned earlier, I didn't know about this and who it affected until months later. We had an aeromedical nurse come over. She was the chief of the aeromedical cell, a major, said, "We have a critically ill patient on the island of Okinawa that has to be moved right now. And I'm like going, Sandy, what's going on? It's a brand new baby that has multiple birth defects. I don't know if the baby's going to die on the plane ride over or not, but we have to move this child now. And I remember saying to her, look, can the baby even fly? And she goes, look, it doesn't matter at this point. We have to put the baby in something to move it to Travis, to the hospital at Travis Air Force Base, and we've got to do it right now, Mark. And I said, okay, well, hang on. Let me look through here. Oh, wait a minute. Here's a KC-10 that is just getting ready to leave to deposition after their SID 30 days was up. Oh, man, they're taxiing right now. So I hurriedly pick up the phone, call Yokota, and I tell them, hey, Gucci 3-1, where is it? What is it doing? Well, sir, they're taxiing out right now. And I said, stop them. Have them turn around and go back to parking right now. Okay, sir, what's going on? And I said, I have a super high priority mission that I need them to fly that's going to require them to go to Okinawa and then home. They'll still go home today, but I need them to go by Okinawa. I tell you what, have the aircraft commander do an HF phone patch with me. Here's my number right here at my desk. That was one of the great things about working at the TACC. I could talk to airplanes anywhere. I had HF radio and we could do HF phone patches. And I told the controller there at Yokota, do not let them take off. Have them come back in and park right now. And she says, okay, sir, they're going home. I go, yeah, I know. That's why I want them to stop. Have the aircraft commander call me either when he comes in or have him do an HF phone patch with me when he parks. The KC-10 went back to its parking spot, shut down the engines, had the APU going, and he does an HF phone patch. Calls directly to my desk. Hey, Major Hasara, this is Captain so-and-so. I'm the aircraft commander on this KC-10. What's going on? I'm breach 746. What's going on? How come you brought us back? Said, so-and-so. I'll call him Captain Young for right now because he sounded like he was a young captain. I said, Captain Young, I've got a real problem right now, and I really, really need your help. Would your crew be willing to wait there for a little bit? We have to upload some things onto your airplane. Go to Okinawa and pick up a mother and a father and a baby that's in a really, really bad way. Well, of course, the whole crew can hear me talking to him over the intercom system because he's talking on an HF radio. And he polls the crew, and the crew goes, are we still going home today? I says, yes, you will make it home, but you're going to make it home probably about 3 to 4 hours later, if that's all right with you guys. And so he clicks off. Of course, now the crew is in the cockpit, and he's talking to him, not over interphone. And just a couple minutes later, he comes back and he says, Major Hasara, Captain Young here, we'll be glad to help you out. What's going on? I says, look, there's a baby that has just been born, literally 30 minutes old, who has multiple birth defects. And I'll be honest with you, Captain Young, I don't know if the baby is going to survive the plane trip home from the information that I have. There's heart problems. There's intestinal problems. There's lung problems. There's esophagus problems. There's all kinds of problems. And of course, the nurse had told me all these things. And they said, okay, sir, whatever, we'll take the mission, as long as we get home. And I said, I will make sure you guys get home. A matter of fact, if you can upload enough gas and fly from Okinawa direct to Travis, and he goes, no, we're not going to be able to do that because of wind. So I said, okay, Guam or Hawaii, where would you rather land? I would rather you land in Hawaii because obviously Tripler's there and we can send the baby there if there's any issues. And they said, yeah, that sounds good. Have us go Yokota to Kadena, Kadena to Hickam to Travis. All right, can you cut it that way? I said, absolutely. And he said, sir, what happens if the baby dies? And I said, when you get to Hickam or you get to Travis, tell them you have human remains on board. I'm just going to be that frank with you. And they go, okay, fine. And I said, what needs to happen now? And the AE nurse was, Nancy was standing in front of me. And I hand her the phone and she says, okay, there's going to be an incubator come out, neonatal doctors, ER doctors, and neonatal nurses. There's going to be about 5 people, and I think she said about 300 pounds of equipment to include the incubator and all the stuff that will keep the baby going. And I said, okay, fine. You got any problems with this? He goes, no, I don't have any problems with this, okay? We're here waiting, and we're ready to go. About 10 minutes later, the AE nurse comes over and says, hey, I think they're at the airplane. I think all the neonatal stuff is being uploaded right now. And sure enough, Captain Young calls me back, HF, hey, all that stuff's loading up right now. We will be ready to taxi in 5 minutes. I'll get all the stuff battened down in the back, and we're on our way to Kadena. I said, perfect. When you get to Kadena and you land there, I want the same exact thing. Call this same number, HF phone patch, and give me the blow-by-blow. When you land and when you take off, when you're in the air, so that I can warn Hickam and get Tripler ready in case you need to go there. And then, of course, Travis, when you land, and get everybody going when you get there. He says, perfect. So airplane goes down to Kadena, and the crew calls me, and they said, oh, Major Hasara, this baby's in a bad way. I'm really worried that this baby's not going to make it. And I said, Captain Young, I understand completely, but those doctors are going to do everything they can to keep that baby alive. And he says, Major Hasara, this baby's got a lot of problems. The parents are just in shock. The mother is just in shock. I mean, it's only been a couple hours since she's had this baby, and now she's on an airplane going home with it, and it's in bad shape. We've got the family from Kadena on board. The mother, the father, the other kids are all here, and I'll call you when we're airborne. Okay. And you know what, folks? I didn't key into that. He says, it's a family from Kadena. I was thinking so much about the mission and getting it done that I didn't key into that really, really important piece of information when he told me that. So, flies Kadena to Hickam. They land at Hickam. He's doing an HF phone patch, calls me on the phone through the HF radio. Sir, we're here on the ground. We're uploading gas as fast as we can. We're going to take off as soon as we can, if that's okay with you. I said, yes. Keep going. Thanks for getting Tripler all arranged for us. They've already called us and said, hey, what help do you need from us? The baby's not doing good. And I said, I know, Captain Young. Do the best that you can. Do everything you can to support those doctors back there. But please, everybody pray that baby boy makes it to Travis and to the hospital there. In the air, on the way to Travis, he calls me again. We're airborne. We're on our way. Landing time looks good. Make sure that we have everything that we need there, ambulances, everything to meet us on the ramp. I said, AE cell has already got that all arranged. Everything's done. Nancy's already signed it. Should be on your 57 there at the bottom. I see it as a note. Goes, yep, okay, there it is. I got it. And then they land at Travis. The baby's hanging on. The kids of the family are taken by a group of folks. Mother and father get in the ambulance with the baby, head off to the hospital. I think now it's been, 7 or 8 hours since the baby's been born. It's not doing well at all. They get it to the hospital, and I call the Travis command post the next day when I get in there. I said, hey, any word on how the baby's doing? No, baby's been in surgery several times. It's in critical condition. It's in the neo ICU. Mother seems to be recovering from having the baby. Father's doing as best as he can, but we'll see what happens. And I said, okay, fine. Back to normal in the West Cell. Missions are moving. We kind of go back to normal. We all talk about this particular mission because there's a lot of lessons learned. Having an airplane return back to parking, putting the neonatal group on board, moving it down there, picking up this critical patient. We had to write all of that stuff down because we knew we'd probably have to do it again. And sure enough, later on we did with a heart patient out of McMurdo, which I've mentioned already. So we had this kind of hot wash of this particular mission, but we went went back to just doing everyday missions. Well, one day I'm walking through the TACC and I see Dave Ingerson, who was a Stanival pilot instructor pilot at the 909th. And I said, Dave, what are you doing here? I thought you were going to Moscow to be the air attaché to Russia. He goes, I was, Sluggo, but we have a real problem in our family right now. And I go, what's that? And he takes this picture out of his pocket and shows it to me. And it's a baby inside an airplane in a incubator. And I look at Dave and I get kind of lump in my throat like I got now. And I said, KC-10 out of Yokota, neonatal doctors, 5 nurses, 4 doctors, 300 pounds of equipment, picked you guys up at Kadena, flew you to Hickam where you refueled, and then on to Travis with ambulance waiting for you. And he goes, Sluggo, how in the world do you know that? That's exactly what happened. And I got a little choked up. And I said, Dave, I am the guy that cut that mission. I'm the guy that stopped that KC-10 at the end of the runway from going home and turned it around to get all that stuff on board to help your little boy live. And he just started bawling. He said, Sluggo, you saved my little boy's life. And I said, brother, I had no idea. I should have keyed in when they said Kadena, but I didn't. Because, there's all these different people at Kadena. It could be anyone. He goes, no, it was me and my wife. The baby has serious birth defects. And we had to cancel my attaché job to Moscow. And we, of course, had to take an assignment to some place that had a really good neonatal facility. And believe it or not, St. Louis has got one of the best ones in the United States. In the last 3 months, my son has had 7 surgeries, Sluggo. His bowels weren't connected to the right things. He's got joint problems. He's got valve problems. He's got ventricle problems. He's got esophageal lung problems, all these different things. And so we came here to the TACC because they've got the medical facilities. And I says, isn't that amazing, brother? I had no idea that I had your little boy on that airplane. And he just thanked me profusely for saving his little boy's life. And, that was pretty constant. We saved a lot of people's lives. I went back and looked through my officer efficiency ratings, and according to my OERs, I have 9 saves. And this little boy was one of them. Unfortunately, years later, the little boy had, I think by this time, like 21 surgeries. And his little heart gave out one day when he was, I think, 4 years old. It's been a long time since I've talked to Dave. I just saw a thing on LinkedIn. Dave just graduated from theological seminary, is now Dr. Pastor Dave. But he told me his little boy did, in fact, pass away years later. But they had some good years with his little man. And that was all because I saw a KC-10 that was about to take off, stopped it, and got the right people on board. If you want to read about another humanitarian mission like this, go pick up my book, Tanker Pilot, Lessons from the Cockpit. It's on Amazon in all 4 formats, hardback, softback, Kindle, and Audible. And there's 32 pictures in the book, but there's a chapter called Korean Air Flight 801. 747 lands in a storm in the hills on approach to Agana, Guam. Massive loss of life, like over 250 people. But a lot of people live, badly burned, but they live. And we had to have the National Transportation Safety Board GO team over there in 24 hours. We got it there in 17, and then ended up bringing some of the burned patients back here to Brooks in San Antonio to get worked on. One of the survivors, 9-year-old Gracie Chung, didn't make it, but at least we got her back home. And you can read about that there. The TACC, the 618th AOC, does all kinds of these humanitarian missions. Guys or gals injured, casualties over in the Middle East, they all come through the aeromedical evacuation cell. Let me move on to another story from the TACC. Pepe Le Pew told me this would be a great learning experience for you. And as you can see from the KC-10 mission, I'd never done an AE mission like that, saving a patient like that. And so this learning curve at the TACC was always a steep vertical line. We get a phone call from the Navy, and I think it came to the senior's desk. He's saying, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. So it's somebody that outranks an 06 colonel, which means admiral, lower half, rear admiral, whatever. It's a flag officer. And he puts the phone down, and he said, hey, Colonel K, Sluggo, come over to my desk. I need to talk to you. I said, okay, sir. And so we gather up, a writing pad and walk over. And he says, you're not going to believe this. There is an Aegis cruiser that is to go up into the northern Arabian Gulf. They're at Diego Garcia right now, and they just did a check on all of their Harpoon anti-ship missile batteries. All of the batteries are bad on all, I think he said 16 missiles. And so I'm thinking to myself, I don't even know where to get Harpoon batteries. And of course, where are they at? They're at the Navy base in Japan. So now we have to figure out how we're going to get these Harpoon batteries out of storage, check the batteries, get the batteries on an airplane, and of course, there is hazards of batteries being on airplanes. As we know, there was an airplane that crashed in Miami because the batteries burned through the airplane, and get those to Diego Garcia so they can get into the northern Arabian Gulf and relieve an Aegis cruiser that's supposed to come home. Now, my first thought was just swap batteries. Nope, can't do that because the Aegis cruiser is in the northern Arabian Gulf, will be going through the Strait of Hormuz, and has to have live Harpoon missiles. The Aegis cruiser at Diego cannot go through the Strait of Hormuz because all of its batteries are bad. And I went, okay, well, let's see what we can do here. Sure enough, we coordinate with the Navy base, I think it's Sasebo, and we get these batteries on one of these SID missions. Now, they wanted it to come direct. Well, that ain't going to happen. You can't go from Tokyo, Japan, direct to Diego Garcia without going over China and a bunch of other countries that aren't real friendly to us. So, and I believe it was a 141, ends up taking the batteries. They load them on as special cargo, do all the paperwork for them because, again, they're hazardous material. Take off, go down to Singapore, land at Singapore. There's a folks at Singapore that apparently check the batteries out to make sure they're the right batteries, they've got enough power in them, all those different kinds of things. And then they leave Singapore, get to Diego Garcia, and there's a truck waiting for them, waiting for these batteries to come off of the C-141. And of course, they have them like right next to the back ramp. Forklift goes up, picks these things up. I guess they're heavy. I don't know. 16 of these batteries must be heavy because it took a forklift to get them off. And they literally put them on a truck and they race off the ramp. The Aegis cruiser is in the lagoon at Diego Garcia. So now they got to put them on another boat to take them to the Aegis cruiser. Well, they get all the batteries exchanged somehow, and I do not know if that meant having to take the missiles out of their tubes on the fantail of the Aegis cruisers, bringing them on shore and doing it. I don't know. 2 days later, I get a message from the Navy, and an admiral that I believe was at Diego Garcia saying, thank you for getting these batteries moved in such a timely manner. And the reason was they were able to make up the time to get into the northern Arabian Gulf they weren't going flank speed, but they were going pretty fast. And they made up the delay time for their changeover with the Aegis cruiser that was already in the northern Arabian Gulf. The reason they needed the HARP missiles at that time period, and this is the 90s, the Iranians are rattling sabers like crazy. There's a lot of these patrol boats that are going out, and everybody has missions in Libya still at the forefront of their brains because there was a Libyan patrol boat that A6s not only launched a harpoon at, but they also dropped a bunch of rock bombs on it. And you can go on the web and see the pictures of this Libyan patrol boat, and it is just smashed literally from bow to stern. But one of the big threats that they felt going through the Strait of Hormuz was having these patrol boats come out in swarms, and the Harpoon missiles were critical for defending the carrier battle group and, of course, all the other ships in the battle group going through the Strait of Hormuz with harpoons. So having 16 dead batteries meant they had 16 dead missiles, and they couldn't go through the straits. I think the rest of the battle group continued up and were up there, and then these guys met them just prior to the Strait of Hormuz, and then they all went through together. But yeah, it was cool when the senior got a really nice email from the Navy Admiral at Diego Garcia say, hey, thanks for getting these batteries to us. Thank the West Cell for their responsiveness to this, and understand there's some Major Hasara that was able to get these things moving and get them to us. And we really appreciate it. So the cruiser ended up actually being only just a couple hours late instead of a couple days late because we got those batteries to them in time. Just thought of one story that I want to pass along to you guys. This was one of the really stranger missions that I dealt with and ran while I was a West Cell duty officer. It shows up in the computer 3 Travis C5s loaded to the gills. I mean, they're almost at their max takeoff weight, and they're filled with lumber, thousands of board feet of lumber, and each of them is carrying, I think it was 32 rolls, big rolls of sheet plastic, visqueen. And it had a FEMA call sign. And I thought, what in the world is going on here? And again, this is during a changeover, and I'm just learning this and seeing this for the first time. A FEMA call sign means, of course, it's going to some emergency location. And I look where it's at, and I see that it's going to the Philippines. Well, Typhoon Angela just went over the top of the Philippines and basically wiped it out. I mean, there was a lot of loss of life and property. And I thought, okay, FEMA's getting involved, but what in the world do they need hundreds of board feet of lumber and visqueen? So calling the FEMA director's office that was managing these 3 missions, I said, hey, it's Major Hasara, Tanker Airlift Control Center. I see you've got 3 C5s on the ramp at Travis that are going to the Philippines as part of a humanitarian effort, thinking it's this typhoon that just went across the island, correct? He goes, that is correct, Major. That's what it's for. I said, okay, hundreds of board feet of lumber and visqueen? He goes, yeah, here's how we use it. Right now, there are thousands of people over there who do not have shelter. And we here at FEMA have a plan for sheltering people quickly. And we actually have instructions that just about anybody can follow to build a plastic house out of the lumber and the visqueen. And I said, please explain more about this to me. He says, the houses are like this shape, square, and we know that it takes exactly this board feet of lumber to do it. You precisely mark the lumber. You take out like one long piece and measure it out, and you cut it to the right dimensions and the right lengths and everything, and you basically build the frame for a house. And I said, okay. I'm imagining the sheet plastic goes around it somehow. He goes, yes. You start on the bottom, like the walls, and the visqueen goes around it to kind of make the walls. Then you go up top and lay it across the top so that it makes a roof. And I said, look, these are really, really big rolls of this visqueen. He goes, yeah, I know, but our instructions are written in such a way, you just roll the stuff out, and they have I guess they had some special holder for the rolls because like I said, they were massive. They weighed hundreds of pounds. And they roll it out to a certain length, and then they cut it. And then they cut the board lumber with a circular saw, and they know exactly the right angles to do it at and everything based on this one-page plan. And that's how they made temporary housing for these tens of thousands of people that were now homeless because of what happened during Typhoon Angela. See, it was something different every day. And really, it was sometimes really different. I wouldn't have put a typhoon, board feet, thousands of board feet of lumber and visqueen together in my mind at all. I learned something that day. You can make really fast temporary housing out of this board feet of lumber. You don't need the circular saw. You can just use a regular saw. We've been using those for millenniums. And to cut the visqueen, all you needed was a razor blade. And they actually had the measurements how you cut the visqueen so that it went around the frame. And then they had these big staple guns that you just stapled it to it. And the guy was saying it was pretty sturdy when they did this. And it was a one-sheet plan, and I can't remember the dimensions of the house now, of the temporary facility. It was pretty good size. You could probably fit mom, dad, and 4 kids in it pretty comfortably. But, again, it's a plastic house that you can see through, but they're making thousands of these things as temporary shelters for the people that lost their homes during Typhoon Angela. And Typhoon Angela was a huge, huge typhoon. A lot of people killed, a lot of people left homeless. But once again, and I've told this to people many, many times, the United States is the only nation on the face of the planet that can move literally the population of San Antonio and all of their household goods in just a matter of months. Because that's exactly what happened when we deployed for Desert Shield, Desert Storm. I remember seeing this little factoid that said the airlift effort during Desert Shield to get the forces in theater would allow AMC to move the entire city and population of San Antonio to the Middle East and all of their household goods so they could set up shop when they got there. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. And of course, the Desert Shield campaign to move everything over there only went on for a couple months. I got there November 1st, and we were fighting by the 17th of January. And people were moving, people, parts, and packs, and everything were moving. I think it was in August. He invaded Kuwait August 2nd, and within a week or two, we were moving over there. And I've told people this, like I said, the United States are the only nation on the planet that can literally pack up and move that kind of population or equipment to someplace on the other side of the world. Now, when they had the tsunamis, I think it was in 2006 in the Southeast Asia area, same thing. The airplanes would take off from the West Coast, get refueled just south of Anchorage, and then get refueled again going by Okinawa or mainland Japan on their way into Thailand. I mean, just crazy amount of medical supplies and doctors and lumber and visqueen to make houses and everything moving in less than 24 hours. We would literally start standing up forces, airplanes, air crews, everything we needed based on a CNN news report. Breaking news. Typhoon has just hit the Philippines, and there's thousands feared dead and tens of thousands more left homeless. And we would start planning on that based on that one news report. And I mentioned this in my book about Flight 801, Korean Air Flight 801. We were watching CNN. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, 1 o'clock in the morning, I think Guam time, when Korean Air 801 crashed short of the runway. And there was a breaking CNN news banner that said, hey, this airplane's crashed. I turned to Colonel Kolodka, hollered over to Colonel Bailey, the senior. We all watched the thing together, and Colonel Bailey turned around and said, okay, get ready. You know, we're going to get a phone call. We're going to have to start moving stuff pretty soon. This looks pretty drastic. 30 minutes after Colonel Bailey said that, Vice President Al Gore was on the phone at his desk. And he even hollered over to us, hey, Mark, Colonel K, it's the White House. I bet you this is our phone call. Flight 801 support. And sure enough, that's exactly what it was. Vice President Al Gore had spoken with Governor Gutierrez asking for help. What can the TACC do? And Colonel Bailey says, Mr. Vice President, Major Hasara already has a plan and we're already working it. And he looks over at me and smiles. No pressure, no pressure. But this was the kind of thing that we did a lot. These humanitarian missions, saving Dave Ingerson's little baby boy and sending hundreds of thousands of board feet of lumber and thousands of feet of visqueen, you know, it doesn't seem like much to a lot of people. But sure does make a difference to these families that we saved. Like in the case of the Philippines, their president sent a really wonderful note that eventually ended up in the TACC. We all got to read it and see it. It was pretty spectacular, saying thank you for saving the Philippine people. And there were so many more missions that I could go through. But that's what it was like working at the Tanker Airlift Control Center. So some of my takeaways from working there. First of all, you had to be able to put together an 80% solution when it came time to do Korean Air Flight 801. Colonel Bailey expected a phone call within 30 minutes, and sure enough, 30 minutes later, we got a call. Second thing, we were constantly watching the news because any news report would have an effect on operations in either the West Cell or the East Cell. And operations in the East Cell would have a direct effect on the West Cell and vice versa. Happened all the time. When I had to move the burn patients of Korean Air 801, we ripped off a C-141 that had been supporting President Clinton and his entourage that was going around the United States. We had to figure out an air refueling on it on the West Coast. For these 3 C-5s, they had to go nonstop to the Philippines. We didn't want them to land. The reason we didn't want them to land is because this is where knowledge of a system comes into play. The C-5s were notorious for breaking down at intermediate stops. And a high priority mission of moving all of this board feet of lumber and all of this sheet plastic meant that we did not want the airplane to land except for in the Philippines. So we energized, I believe it was the guard unit at Eielson, the KC-135 guard unit, and of course the 909th at Kadena. Fortunately, I knew all the leadership because they'd all been there when I was there, and I could pick up the phone, the operational support squadron that was doing the planning, and to the leadership and say, hey guys, we really need help for typhoon relief. We're going to need a couple tanker missions that the TACC will pay for and give you the money for to refuel C-5s going down to the Philippines to deliver. And I told them, I said, wait for it. Thousands of board feet of lumber and sheet plastic. And of course they all laughed like, what in the world? And we said, yeah, it's for temporary shelters. They have a frame, FEMA has this frame that they build and put the sheet plastic on. And of course they were happy to help. It's a humanitarian operation. I never got turned down on a humanitarian. Another lesson learned, things that happen in another service are going to affect your service. When we had to move all of these Harpoon missile batteries, and I think we ended up moving just missiles too, that was Air Force support for a Navy primetime high priority mission. Getting those Harpoon missiles energized and back over to the Middle East. And we got lots of kudos for that. We had another lesson learned was being able to organize in your mind the plan that you wanted and then know the different belly buttons that you were going to have to go push to make it happen. Having to go to the tanker or the airlift barrel and say, hey, we have this mission. Does Travis have a 141 crew and a plane that we can dig out of the barrel in the schedule and have it do this mission? Yep, we do. Okay, now we need to get diplomatic clearance to go to the Marshall Islands. The president of the Marshall Islands died, and the State Department said, we got to move him, and I guess he was going to be buried in Hawaii or something like that. And they said, look, this is what we need. Okay. Of course, you have to check the weather, all the diplomatic clearances. Of course, they went through pretty quickly because he was a dignitary. State Department got real energized on this one too. And it's easy to plan missions when it's that high of a priority, but when it's lower priority, sometimes it takes a little longer. Fourth lesson learned. I had lived in the Pacific. I understood all of the cultures and the restrictions and all of the political things that we had to do to get into certain countries. I had a flight that went to Mongolia, a C-5, and we had to put a security detail, a Phoenix Raven team on the airplane going into Mongolia. Now, Mongolia is not one of our big enemies. That's not why these guys were protecting the airplane. During the time that I was in the West Cell, we had a C-5 take off and 2 teenage kids fell out of the wheel well during gear retraction. People were trying to get on our airplanes to come to the States. So we had to understand, of course, all the different cultures and some of the locals trying to make it out. And I knew about these kinds of things because of living over there. We had missions into China all the time. Another one of the crazy missions that we did was the repatriation of Vietnam pilots' remains, guys that had been shot down and crashed over Laos and so forth in these repatriation missions. So you had to know all of the cultural things of going into Vietnam, the times you could go into Vietnam, all of the pomp and ceremony that was going to go on with the repatriation of American servicemen's remains, all of these different things for all of these different countries. And so we had to read through all of the diplomatic clearance and all of the flip pubs, which are the planning pubs that we use in the military to do all these missions. And of course, having lived there, I had an advantage on everybody. And everybody would come to me and say, hey, Mark, they've got like restrictions. They call them quiet hours. They got quiet hours at Misawa. Why is that? And I was able to explain, well, here's how the air base is laid out, but here's what's around it. And here's the town of Misawa, the city of Misawa, and why they want these quiet hours. And most of the Japanese bases, American bases in Japan, had quiet hours. That usually began about 10 o'clock at night, sometimes 9 o'clock at night, and would go till 8 o'clock the next morning, meaning nobody could take off and land during those time periods. I had them all in my head. So that knowledge made me a better West Cell duty officer because I had spent 5 years over there and understood the restrictions, the climate, the culture, and of course, doing exercises with a lot of the different militaries, I understood how their militaries worked. I didn't get very far in the Boy Scouts. I had a rather tragic thing happen early in my Boy Scouting career where I said, I ain't doing this anymore. But the motto, be prepared, went with me throughout my entire life. But I'm telling you, on a day-to-day basis, when you're at the Tanker Airlift Control Center, managing air refueling, aeromedical evacuation, and airlift missions, some of these things you're not going to be prepared for. And they just show up out of the blue. Like I mentioned, all of us know the CNN effect and have heard of it. Within 5 minutes, something that has happened somewhere around the world is going to be on CNN within 5 minutes. And in many cases, we weren't prepared for whatever that situation was. The TACC had a pool of experts that we could go to help create a plan. And sometimes it was only a 60% plan instead of an 80% plan, depending on the urgency of what was happening. But that was one of the great things about the TACC is we had all of these different highly motivated and in many cases extremely experienced people working there. That when we had these oddball situations pop up where we literally had a white sheet of paper and had to build, a kingdom in 45 minutes. I spent 2 years on the Tanker Airlift Control Center floor as a West Cell duty officer before I went upstairs to be the chief of AMC KC-135 and Tanker Tactics. And the last, 9 months of me being a West Cell duty officer, I'd seen just about everything. I could put together a plan from a situation I had no knowledge of other than seeing what was on CNN and come up with a pretty good 80% solution plan within 30 minutes and know who the right people I needed to go to in order to get it from the planning stage to the execution stage and get the beans, butter, lumber, visqueen, batteries. And you know what, folks? When you become that good at your job, that experienced, particularly that confident in your abilities to do it, boy, does it make it fun. Boy, does it make it fun. And I remember having my last counseling session with my boss. There was this form you had to fill out, and you had to date it, and here's all the stuff we're going to talk about. It was like 6 months before you got your OPR, your Officer Proficiency Report. And it was just a kind of, hey, here's some things that you need to navigate through, and here's some things you're doing well, and here's some things, not so well and everything. And I remember the colonel looking at me, saying to me, Sluggo, I can come to you with any problem and know that the plan will not only work, but it's a good plan, and you always exude confidence. And he says, I think that's the one thing people would say about you that makes them sick is Sluggo has a lot of confidence in his abilities. And folks, it's not ego. It's just you got so good at what you were doing because you had to do it so many times, and so many times we had to do it literally from scratch. Like I said, a CNN report would get us going. And those last about 9 months when I was on the floor of the TACC were epic. I learned so much. Never pass up an opportunity to take an assignment. Yeah, you may not like it, but if you're going to learn from it and become an expert at your craft, okay, it's going to suck. Then do it. Man, Tony Robbins, Dean Graziosi, Kirk Duncan, all of these different people that I've talked to that do motivational speaking and help people change their lives have all said the same thing. Embrace the suck, man. Just do it. Pepe Le Pew was right. Colonel Pew was right. When I first got there, I had no confidence in my abilities because I was learning and doing something brand new. But I jumped in it with both feet, and that's what I would say to all of you. Jump in with both feet and learn and become the expert, because then you have OPR bullets like I have on my reports that say, this is my go-to guy. This is my go-to gal. Don't be afraid of getting your hands dirty, getting oil stains on your coveralls, and do the work, do the study, and become an expert. Because it truly is a magnificent feeling when you're on the A-team and if something happens, they come to you, and people like I'm talking about, particularly those of you who are in command positions in the military. You have maybe 5 or 6 people that if things really get nasty, they're the ones that you will go to every time because you know they can do the job. And it's a fantastic feeling. And I'm all about you people feeling fantastic. One last thing before I close. It's been 2 weeks since I've done an episode, and I apologize for that. I know many of you have been waiting for me to post an episode. We were out of town for 5 days to a wonderful event put on by my very good friend, TC Capoletti. TC put on a memorial event for his good friend, Lieutenant J.G. John P. Connors, Navy SEAL, killed during the Panama invasion, trying to save somebody. John was one of his close friends, college roommate. They were having a gala event next to the USS Constitution to raise money to put a statue of Navy SEAL John Connor in his Massachusetts hometown. Would all of you please go to, and I'll put the link in the show notes, themeasureofaman.org, I think it is, and contribute to the statue that they're going to do of John Connors. It's being done by a guy, his name is Chaz. I can't remember his last name, but he is an incredible sculptor. He has done the sculptures of the First Ladies, of numerous presidents, Ronald Reagan. If you go to the Reagan Library, the statue of Ronald Reagan is done by Chaz. George Herbert Walker Bush, George W. Bush at the Bush Library. Those 2 statues have been done by this guy. And the one that he did of John is just incredible. He's all kitted out, carrying his M4. I mean, it was amazing. I think it was a quarter scale model of what the statue is going to look like. But go by Measure of a Man cockpit.org and contribute to this statue. That's where I was. That's why I have been kind of off the radar for a while. And I got to stay with a former aircraft commander, Mike Ryder, Spike, and his sweet wife, Sue. Valerie and I went out there, and we just had a ball. It was just a great time. That's where Valerie and I met. We met in Boston, and we actually got up to Pease, got to stand in another one of the FB-111 drive-thrus, which made me emotional because part of my life was on alert. We just had a great time. And that's why you haven't seen an episode from me for the last 2 weeks, because I was gone for 5 days and still recovering. Man, it rained and it was cold up there. Beautiful the day we landed. Beautiful on Friday. Mike took us for the harbor, and then it got 40 degrees colder and rained through the gala and through the rest of the weekend. But please go by John P. Connors Foundation and contribute to this statue. It's a wonderful thing to do for this Navy SEAL who was killed during Just Cause and the invasion of Panama. This is the 63rd episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit podcast. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Tanker Airlift Control Center. Again, I'm talking specifically during the 95 through 97 timeframe when I was there. It's now called the 618th Air Operations Center. Does a lot of the same things. It's organized differently, run differently, obviously, because of new technology, new communication, and everything. But these are the kinds of things that the 618th AOC continues to do. If you see something on CNN that requires humanitarian relief from the United States, the 618th AOC and Air Mobility Command tankers and airlift aircraft are going to be involved. This episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit podcast is supported by the book Tanker Pilot, Lessons from the Cockpit, found in all 4 formats on Amazon: hardback, softback, Kindle, and Audible. Softback version has 32 pictures in black and white. All the others are in color. To include the Audible and the Kindle version, it's an extra file that downloads when you buy them. Also, Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. Please go by wallpilot.com and take a look at, I think there's 128 ready-to-print 4, 6, 8-foot profiles of famous airplanes that you can buy and stick on the walls of your home, office, or hangar. We did a 30-footer for a guy that flew for TWA, but these are extremely detailed profiles, stenciling on the missiles, the arming key handles. I mean, it's just amazing the research we've done in drawing these things. We also do custom aircraft. So if there's for instance, an F-15E that you want your name on from a particular unit, tail codes with a particular bomb load that you love, we can do it. Ready to print items go between $99 and $159. The custom ones that we do, we charge a bit more for because we have to do all the research for them. Thanks again for tuning in to the Lessons from the Cockpit show. This and previous episodes of my podcast can be found on my website at markhasara.com. I hope you enjoyed this. Brought back a lot of memories because I had forgotten about Dave's baby and that conversation he and I had until I looked through my OPRs here. Look forward to talking to you again next week. Have a great weekend.